Welcome back. We're joined by Jim Carafano. He is one of the country's preeminent figures in the national security arena, certainly in Washington, D.C. He comes by that as a result of his distinguished service in the United States Army, finishing up as a lieutenant colonel. He is also a man who has spent years now honing his skills and making a real contribution to the public policy debate at the Heritage Foundation, where today he is the vice president for the Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy. Jim, welcome back. It's always good to have you with you, my friend.
Hey, good to be with you.
Well, this is Iran Day. We're still trying to dissect what has been done by the president and his minions. It doesn't seem as though it's getting more appealing the more we're able to study the details. What do you make, Jim, of the deal broadly defined and specifically looked at from your perspective as a military man, what it means militarily and strategically?
Yeah, well, in full disclosure, I was never against negotiating to begin with, and here's why. I believe that Iran sees having a nuclear breakout capability as fundamentally a vital interest. And you never negotiate away vital interests. So you think back to the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. The only thing we wanted from North Vietnam was a recognition that an independent South Vietnam would be okay. It's the one thing the North never was going to negotiate away, and we all know that, how that ended, the 40th anniversary of the North Vietnamese army marching into Saigon. If the one thing we know they're not going to trade away is the capability to be a nuclear weapons power, then there's no way these negotiations could ever get to a reasonable end, and that's exactly what we saw. So when the president stood up and declared we would block every pathway to them getting a bomb, we know that's not true, and that is the core of concern about the deal in the Congress, in the countries of the regions, which are very, very much more afraid now than they were before the deal was signed.
Jim, we have, in addition to concerns about the nuclear weapons program, which I couldn't agree with you more, is going forward apace under this deal, but also a new reason to be concerned that this negotiation has led to, or will shortly lead to, an easing of Iranian access to conventional weapons. And, of course, vast amounts of money that they can spend on it, among other purposes. How serious a problem does that represent?
Yeah, that's a very underrated part of this problem here is we all complain about, there's going to be a nuclear arms race. Iran, people are afraid Iran's going to get a nuclear weapon, and Turkey's going to want one, and Saudi Arabia's going to want one, Egypt's going to want one, and everybody believes that's valid. Even the administration recognizes that that's a real concern. But what we're seeing is we are seeing a conventional arms race. Countries are racing to arm themselves out of concern of the rising Iranian power. In turn, the Iranians are amassing massive amounts of cash as a result of the sanctions release. And when you add that on top of all the other economic activity, we could be talking about $300 to $400 billion being dumped in this country. And then once they have access to the conventional arms market unrestrained, you're going to see a massive conventional arms race. This is an incredibly dangerous situation. Conventional weapons pouring into the region on top of multiple nuclear armed countries in the region. And that would be okay if we didn't care, but they call it the Middle East for a reason. It's in the middle of everything. It's the linchpin between Asia and Europe and the United States. It's not just for energy, but for finance and the movement of people. You worry, for example, about migrants flooding into Western Europe. Destabilizing this part of the world is a prescription for global disaster. Ebola is the thing about, oh my God, wouldn't that be terrible if Ebola was everywhere? Here is the contagion of war and violence potentially grow everywhere. That's what's at stake here. When you sign a deal which is supposed to bring peace, and the next day people are frantically worried about everything getting worse, that's not a comforting, hopeful sign.
Jim, let me ask you to respond quite pointedly and directly to the principal argument. When we strip everything else away, the principal argument now being made by President Obama and his supporters or apologists, and that is, well, if not this deal, we will have war. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I think it's this deal and war. I think once you sign this deal, you're actually accelerating the likelihood of regional conflict. I think that's a fact, and it's a lie, right? It's not this deal or war. I actually think if we went back to the status quo of just heavily sanctioning the regime, that was actually working pretty effectively in terms not of solving the problem of Tehran, but in terms of keeping the regime on the defensive. The status quo in my mind would be much, much more preferable to this.
Jim, you have been working for a long time, and the Heritage Foundation as well, on one particular facet of this that I think is now really coming to the forefront, or should, and that is that the Iranian nuclear weapons program will give Tehran, in due course, for sure, the option of exercising what apparently their doctrine calls for, according to Congressman Trent Franks in more than 20 places, as a matter of fact, an electromagnetic pulse attack against this country designed to devastate our electric grid and therefore our country. How serious a threat do you regard that as being? And if it were to eventuate, what might the consequences be?
So, look, here's why you worry about that. First of all, what would it mean? And a very interesting study just out from a research center in London.
Sponsored, by the way, by Lloyd's of London. They know something about risk.
Right, and they're also insurance companies. But estimating the cost of a loss of the electric grid in the United States, $1 trillion, right? So think about, if you had $1 trillion, you could save the Greek economy.
You could make a substantial dent on ours as well, now that I think about it.
So it's so just the economic loss. I mean, that's not all the other human things that would go on with that. Just the economic loss is unbelievably massive. So we know it's incredibly dangerous to lose the grid. We just know that. We know for a fact that EMP can take a grid out. That's just physics. We know that. And if you were a country like Iran and you want to threaten the United States, it would take you a long time and a lot of money to have a comparable nuclear arsenal, having hundreds of or thousands of weapons that you could deploy. But a handful of weapons which essentially could do the same amount of damage is going to hold America just as effectively at risk as having 1,000 nuclear warheads. And so from an Iranian perspective, that strategy makes sense.
Yeah, and Jim, that's even if they don't actually mean what they say, which is death to America. That is, they're not just interested in holding us at risk and deterring us from interfering with them, but they're actually interested in destroying us. Our guest is Jim Carafano. He's the Vice President for National Security and Foreign Policy at the highly regarded Heritage Foundation here in Washington, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, now retired, and the author, most recently, I believe, of Wiki at War, Conflict in a Socially Networked World. Jim, let me turn to one other thing you've been musing about, and that is parallels between what the North Koreans did when we were led to believe we had successfully negotiated them out of having nuclear weapons, and what their friends and allies and partners in crime, the Iranians, are likely to do. Talk a little bit about the parallels here.
Right. So actually, when the president got up and said yesterday, we have blocked every path to a nuclear weapon, when you look at the nuclear and missile infrastructure that Iran has today, not that they might have 2 or 3 years from now, but that they have today, and you look at what North Korea had before it did a breakout, and you look at what countries like Pakistan had before they did a breakout, they have that same capability. So it's already there. We're not preventing them from having a nuclear breakout capability. They're already there. And if North Korea and Pakistan are any example, then the notion that somehow we block them, that statement is already kind of overcome by events.
So in your professional judgment, James Carafano, you believe that when the president says this deal will assure, set aside this question of blocking the path and so on, but at the very least, he's giving us the assurance that it will be at least a year before the Iranians can break out. Do you discount that?
Well, the Iranians have no reason to break out in the next year because they're going to get $150 billion in cash. I wouldn't break out either if you're going to give me $150 billion in cash. I take the $150 billion and then I break out.
But is it a year that they will buy through this mechanism, or do you think it's far less?
I think if they're lucky, they'll buy 2 years. But here's why the president isn't lying to us, right? The president is looking at the piece of paper in front of him and saying if everything in the world unfolds exactly as written in this piece of paper, Iran won't get a nuclear weapon.
On my watch.
Well, for 10 years, right? But what you have to weigh against that is Iran's record. They've never abided by any piece of paper that they signed. They didn't abide by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. If they did, we wouldn't even be doing this today. And their fundamental goal is to have a weapon.
Jim Carafano of the Heritage Foundation, thanks again, as always, for what you do there and your past service to our country as well. Keep it up and come back to us again very soon. We'll talk with Ambassador Roger Noriega next, right after this, about the hemisphere, what's going down there straight ahead.